Hi, and welcome to Free Exchange, hosted by the Hammond Institute for Free Enterprise here at Lindenwood University. Today I'm talking with my colleague Howard Wall, who's the director of the Hammond Institute for Free Enterprise, and we're going to be discussing discrimination, wage discrimination. Right. Do we want to start with gender?
Yes, we do want to start with gender.
Because what happened over the weekend?
Well, I didn't watch the Oscars.
Neither did I.
No.
I heard it on the radio.
Yes, so Patricia Arquette won an Oscar for something.
Boyhood. Excellent film.
A supporting actress or something,
Yeah,
Best
yeah.
supporting actress. And she made some plea for gender equality, talking about the gender wage gap.
Yeah.
That's 78 cents on the dollar. So what it means is women on average, their annual pay is 78% of the average man's annual pay.
Yeah, and Meryl Streep said yes, and I think some other famous people got up and whooped for her comment.
Yeah, well, you know, it's unfortunate because it's just so innumerate, and this comes up every year. You know, there's new data is released on this gap, and then there's the usual calls for ending this wage discrimination, and then there's the usual debunking of it. And it is so easily debunked, and then it stops once it's debunked and nothing is done when there's actually a problem and that this number just has nothing to do with it.
Okay,
so it detracts from the actual issue.
And just to put this in context, I think part of the reason Patricia Arquette brought it up is because of the hacking scandal. We saw, because of the emails, we saw some of the disparities in male and female.
In Hollywood, women get paid less than men.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know why that is. Perhaps it's because they bring in less money than men. They're not action heroes as frequently, or whatever in the high earning pictures. So maybe it's just that the market is speaking in that sense. But if so, then that's Hollywood's problem, if there is a problem. It's not something that they should, this innumeracy shouldn't be something they should burden the rest of us with.
So first of all, just explain what's wrong with the numbers.
Well, there's just so many things wrong with it because it's the number, the 78 cents on the dollar. It's meant to say that, women are just paid different amounts for the same work.
Right.
And that's just complete, it may or may not be true, but this number of 78 cents is complete nonsense because, first of all, it's annual wages. It's not hourly wages. So women work fewer hours in a year. Right? They work fewer weeks in a year and fewer hours per day on average.
Okay.
So
they're not adjusting for that?
No. So they're not adjusting for even the time that you're working. It's just in a year how much is earned.
Okay.
So you adjust for that, and that's worth like 5 or 6 cents, something like that, out of this.
And we're assuming a lot of that is just life choices. You're either the one staying home with the kids, or you're taking more vacation.
Right. Or is women more likely to work part-time?
Okay.
So that doesn't take into account part-time versus full-time differences either.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
My gosh, that seems ridiculous to me.
Of course.
Isn't that just what economists do? Is they adjust for these things, right?
So this number is thrown out, and you can easily toss out a big chunk of the gap just by changing the number, changing it to hourly wages versus annual wages.
Okay, gotcha.
Now, the other things that you need to take care of are things, that will determine people's wages, whether they're men or women. It's experience, right? So women tend to have less experience than men, partly because they're haven't been in their same job as long as men on average.
More likely to come in and out of the workforce because of
they're more likely to come in and out of the workforce because of children. And most of the differences that you see between men and women in this wage gap is due to the fact, I believe it's a fact, that women are the ones who bear the children.
It is a fact, yeah.
And I don't know that there are any public policies out there that are addressing that problem.
Right, it's just that darn biology. Yeah.
So it's women are much more likely to, give birth, infinitely more likely to give birth than men, and therefore are more likely to be out of work, either before, during, and after childbirth, and then raising their kids for a few years. So they'll have accumulated less experience by the time they're, say, 35, 40 years old.
Sure.
And this really cuts into someone's wages, their experience. And not only that, it's that you have what economists call human capital depreciation, when if you're out of the labor force, you're not keeping up with your your profession. And that will differ profession by profession. Obviously for, say, physicists or engineers or something, it's more of a problem than for other professions.
Things develop quickly, you have to keep up with the literature.
But that's part of the explanation of why, women are also in different professions.
Yeah.
They tend to be in different professions on average than men, and part of that is also linked to the fact that they're having babies.
Yeah.
So
they want the flexibility.
If they want the flexibility and they want professions that have a lower human capital depreciation.
Yeah.
So you're not going to get into, it's more costly to get into, say, medicine and be a doctor rather than a nurse, say, because your skills deteriorate rapidly if you take 5 years off of being a doctor or a brain surgeon, something like that. Whereas even specialties within medicine, the deterioration is different, and you'll find men and women in those professions in different rates.
Right.
And most of these things are consistent with the fact that women have children and will be out of the workforce at different times, or have to, have less time during a week.
Now, in some countries, they try to make up for this fact by giving extended periods of basically requiring that the corporation holds your job, right, for several years, and having a lot of maternity leave and required daycare and things like this, basically to get the women into the jobs that they would otherwise choose not to go into.
That probably has a lot of the opposite effects, because this now makes women more expensive to hire. Because you're not only going to have to, because some women won't just take their 2 months off, they might take a month off. But if it's legislated that everyone gets 2 months off, then it's just now more expensive to hire women because you've legislated them to be higher cost.
Well, if we legislate paternity leave, then it would be equal. I'm playing devil's advocate.
Well, I suspect that, again, the reason that men don't stay home, I've had 2 children.
Yes.
Well, I haven't born them. I've had 2 children and raised them. But I remember when they were infants that I was also pretty useless at breastfeeding.
Yeah.
So I wasn't very good at the birthing part. I was auxiliary to that. And also the feeding.
Yeah.
And it was their mom was primarily responsible for that. So again, all the paternity leave in the world wouldn't have changed that.
Yeah.
And these things that just happen at the margin, and it just adds up over the course of one's life.
What do you mean, it happened at the margin?
Well, you say, well,
phrase.
that's only for a year. It doesn't debilitate a woman through her entire work career, but just for a year for a child or something like that. And it's, well, yes, but that's an important year. And then it's often difficult to go back to work when you don't want to go back to work.
I mean, coming in and out is always hard and slows you down.
Right.
That makes sense.
I mean, one of my neighbors was a pediatrician. There was a couple. Man and wife were pediatricians, and the mom just gave up being a doctor once she had kids. All that years of medical school, she said, well, she wanted to be a mom instead. And it's an extremely difficult decision, but this is what people do. And if you just look at these numbers of this gender wage gap, all of those decisions are inside that gender wage gap.
Right.
And it explains away most of the gap.
So what's left?
Well, it depends on what you look at, but you can usually get it down to, say, 2-3 cents on the dollar. So women make 98 cents for every dollar that a man gets. But that gap is just what's left unexplained.
Okay.
But then you can look at different subsets of men and women, and because you have to eliminate the effect of having children. And if you look, and of differences in profession, but if you look at, say, 25-year-olds in law firms, then men and women make almost identical wages. There's no gap there.
Right.
So, but then that's just in one profession. In other professions, that would not be true.
Do you think that the 3% or whatever it might be is explained by something irrational? Like, for instance, I've heard that taller people make more money and people with more hair make more money. And so you think, okay, well, men are taller, they're bigger, they seem more authoritative. Is it possible that, we have subtle subconscious things that are explained? I mean, for instance, for myself, I find that women that I talk to very often don't ask for a raise in the way that a man might. It doesn't occur to them that they deserve one.
Well, no, as I tell my students, my female students, I say, to be assertive, because, the guys in the class are not any better than you, but they'll tell you how much better they are.
Oh, yeah. No, exactly. So you might have just culturally more confidence as a male than a female, and therefore, obviously a company's not going to pay you more if you don't ask them to, oftentimes. And so it strikes me that 2 or 3% could just be explained by a cultural phenomenon that we may have a problem with. We may want to encourage women to have more confidence and to ask for what they want.
I might encourage men to have less confidence. I'm not sure, but the confidence gap is
just
certainly
straight
part
lying
of it.
about their qualifications.
It's a BS gap.
Yeah. No, and I've heard that from many sources.
Yeah.
Many sources. And so you have a cultural education that comes with your gender, but there's nothing that the law could really do to address that. You would have to have a shift in
I think
attitudes.
there are laws that women in the same job have to get paid the same as men in the same job with the same experience. So there's equal pay for equal work.
Okay.
So, and there is actual discrimination against women in the labor force. We've seen it.
Sure, absolutely.
It's just, but I think with this number, the 78 cents, if you just think, if this is true, look around in your own workplace and say, okay, there's a man or someone of the opposite sex in my same job. Are they really getting paid? Am I getting paid 78% what they are? And it's just not true. You just don't. Individuals do not see this because most of it is an illusion. It's these other things that are explaining it. And also, if you're saying, well, maybe half the people are just being discriminated against, half the women are, well, if the other half aren't, they're making as much as the men. That means that for this 78 cents to make any sense, it means that half the women are getting paid 50 cents on the dollar.
Yeah.
And that's just obviously absurd. That's just not true.
Yeah.
We just don't see that in our day-to-day lives.
And there's a general agreement on this in the economics profession. Yeah. Okay, so when we come back after the break, I want to talk about the same issue with regard to race. Can we do that?
Sure.
Okay.
It's a very different issue, but we can
It's a
address
different issue. Okay, great. We'll see what we can come up with. Join us after the break.
A full life measured in seats starts with the right ones early on. Car crashes are a leading killer of children 1 to 13. Learn how to prevent deaths and injuries by using the right car seat for your child's age and size.
A boy born in Joplin, Missouri was fascinated by anything with wheels and a motor. The odds of him going on to fascinate millions with his talent? 1 in 260,000. The odds of this born racer having 157 career top 10 finishes in NASCAR? 1 in 125 billion. The odds of him winning both the Daytona 500 and the Brickyard 400 in the same year? 1 in 195 million. The odds of a child being diagnosed with autism? 1 in 68. I'm NASCAR driver Jamie McMurray, and my niece has autism. Learn more at autismspeaks.org/signs.
Get out to the forest.
Let the kids connect to their roots. It's gonna be so much fun. Yeah! Woo-hoo!
Hey guys, wait up!
And discover the wonders of nature with your family.
These trees are the key to our way of life.
Fresh air.
What a glorious morning!
Clean water.
Woohoo! This is great!
An endless forest adventure.
Let's rock this jungle!
Yo, this is untapped territory.
How amazing!
Visit discovertheforest.org to find a forest near you.
Hi, and welcome back to the Free Exchange. Howard, before we left for the break, we wanted to talk about possible forms of discrimination that are racial in nature, but you have a little little addendum to our discussion about gender discrimination. What's that?
Well, we were talking about sort of solving what gender discrimination there is.
Yeah.
And, we see that there is gender discrimination.
Yeah, sure.
But, and this means someone consciously making the decision to prefer a man to a woman just because of the gender difference, not because of any difference in productivity or anything like that.
And can I assume that we mean even if that's subconscious on their part?
Yeah.
That they just happen to feel more favorable towards the man. They may not realize that.
Yeah. And I have no problem at all accepting that that's
me neither. I'm sure that happens all the time.
Fairly widespread.
Yeah.
But also, my limited observation is that it differs a lot by what field you're in and what your labor market is. Right? So the more competitive your labor market is, the less likely that's going to happen to you, because competition for your services, if there's a lot of, if you're a woman, you have a lot of competition for your labor, then that discrimination becomes very costly to employers.
They want the skill. They don't.
Because
they
want
care
the
less
skills,
and
that's very expensive.
Yeah.
So they're going for every last advantage that they have. But if you have an uncompetitive labor market, and it could be in your profession or in your region or anything like that, you can have less competition. Then you'll likely to see more of this discrimination making more of a difference. So for example, if you go to, let's use the example of, say, lawyers in Manhattan, right? Men and women, lawyers in Manhattan. Extremely competitive market for lawyers. I wouldn't expect to be a lot of discrimination there for much of what's going on, maybe at the promotions at the higher level, but then that's difficult because you also get the experience thing coming in. Or with nurses. Nursing is very competitive, and women do not make less than men in nursing. In fact, depending on how you look at it, they make more than men. But so the more competition there is, then this can be driven. Discrimination becomes more costly and can disappear. And you look at it across different disciplines in academia, and I was shocked to find out that your own discipline, philosophy, has even fewer women than economics.
16%. Yeah, I think we might be the worst, except engineering, possibly.
It rivals engineering. In economics, now it's like 35% or something of new PhDs are women. So the ratio is changing quite
really
a bit.
Bad,
But once you get into these professions, once you get a PhD, there's very little competition for your services, because you're in a very narrow labor market. You're an academic, and then there are only so many universities in a town, and you're not very mobile, so there's not much competition, and it's less costly for there to be discrimination in those cases. So I would say that there could be more discrimination in, say, universities than in the real world.
Although there may be more pressure just culturally to have a diverse faculty or
maybe,
something like
but
that.
in terms of wages and even hiring decisions, a male-dominated. I mean, you can have a profession that is male-dominated, say philosophy, where 84% of them are men in this profession. But if that labor market is extremely competitive, then that won't matter. That's not an indication of how much discrimination there will be. But if you have that in a relatively uncompetitive labor market with not many buyers, right, not many employers, then the discrimination is not so costly, so you can actually see it. Not necessarily in the wages, but in whether people are hired at a certain job instead of another, and so on. And this tends to come out in the average wages.
Okay, so let me just clarify. You used two examples that both involve a lot of education, academia and lawyers. But would you say that on the whole, the fact that the more skilled the labor, generally the more competitive that sometimes is, then does that mean that unskilled laborers are more affected by gender discrimination?
It could be. I think it probably depends on where you live. Because some local labor markets are more competitive than others.
Sure, yes. Sometimes you need unskilled laborers.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also unskilled labor, there are advantages and disadvantages to being unskilled. An advantage is that if you're a bank teller, or if you work at a grocery store, you have experience at that, so you have some skills and experience, then you're valued at lots of different employers, right? Those skills you have are mobile across a lot of employers.
I see.
So
what
there
you're
can
saying.
be some competition for your skills.
Okay.
But the example of an academic, it's that there aren't that, although you have these skills, they're not very mobile. Right? They don't translate well into other jobs. So you can have generalized human capital as opposed to specific human capital, and that also matters. That changes the amount of competition for your skills. So competition can work to eradicate discrimination, gender discrimination, or any other kind of discrimination. And I've put this to practice. I think it's like a Moneyball example. It's that there are some bargains out there if you're an employer. If you believe there's discrimination, then you should be hiring women.
Right.
Because you believe that the market is undervaluing them, and you should go and hire women because they're more productive than
it's a good deal.
Than the market is indicating. So you could be able, and I find that's actually true.
Right.
So that's why I suspect, even if I've not seen it all that frequently, that there must be some systemic discrimination in the labor market. But it's nothing like the 78 cents on the dollar thing. That's just nonsense.
Right.
Because even if it's 2 or 3 cents on the dollar, that points to a huge amount of discrimination.
Yeah.
That could be
it's a lot of money.
Half
over
the
course
women are paid 7 or 8 cents less than men.
Right.
That means half the women are being discriminated against to a large extent.
Right.
Which is a big problem. But the debate is all about this, 78 cents on the dollar thing, which again is so easily debunked, and then it just stops.
Right,
then the debate stops,
I see.
And you never get down to actually addressing
the
whatever
issue gets
issue
dropped
there actually
because
is.
it looks like it's a mistake. And what you're saying is the whole issue is not a mistake. It's the numbers that they're putting
this
on
portrayal
it
of it is just a mistake, and it's just
right.
And it's just exhausting every year. If you can't. Every year I come out and I have to re-debunk this easily debunked thing, and then you have to remember to get back to saying, okay, now that is debunked,
right,
then there's the actual issue. But then they don't, the other side will just be saying, no, it's true, blah, blah, blah.
Well, I remember hearing on NPR an advocate for disabled workers. And he was trying to point out how, first of all, how important it is to disabled people to work to whatever extent that they can. But then he was also pointing out that employers oftentimes, due to just their own probably subconscious prejudices or maybe just mistaken, they're mistaken in certain ways. They don't realize how valuable these workers can sometimes be. They're extremely loyal, they're extremely dependable, et cetera, et cetera. And it reminds me of what you were saying in the sense that you can simply sell the fact that this is a good deal, right? Take advantage of a bargain while it lasts, right? Because then eventually everybody realizes that that these women are worth as much as the men, and that'll close.
Yeah.
That gender gap.
Well, and I think it has closed a lot in the last 30 years. Women are much more prevalent in the labor force than they were 30 or 40 years ago, and now they're a majority of university students, of college students. Are now over half.
More than a majority, yeah.
And also I think in medical school they're close to half, if not more than half. And law school, or maybe it's in law school, they're close to half or something like that. So there's been tremendous strides, but yet we still see this gap. Even among lawyers and doctors, but then you can look that there's a choice within the profession about which subfield you go into, and that's exactly the pattern that you see when you look at the economy as a whole.
And I think philosophically, there's this debate over why women are making the choices they're making and whether or not, that's partially, and this is sort of not economics, right? Now we're talking about culture, because then we have to say, women are not encouraged in mathematics, even though they're just as capable up to a certain age, and then all of a sudden they're kind of told like, oh, that's not your field or something. And I think that's all probably perfectly relevant.
Yeah, and it's not part of this wage discrimination thing.
Yeah, right. It's kind of it's an underlying.
That may or may not be an issue, and there's these studies about boys being called on more frequently in school.
Yeah.
But now there's studies showing that boys are discriminated against in school.
That it's flipped.
And
it's
who
flipped
knows?
now. Yeah.
And those are important things to look at.
Yeah.
But when you're talking about what economic policies to have or what labor market policies, then you have to get the actual numbers straight.
Now, I don't know how much time we're really going to have left to talk about race, but you feel like that issue is very different from the gender issue?
It's extremely different because, well, first of all, it's not quite the biological difference, right? With women,
True.
It's birth women give birth, men do not. And
Yeah.
that explains many of the choices that women make relative to men, and then the labor market outcomes. With, say, blacks and whites, that's not really the case.
Yeah.
And there have been all sorts of, and there's not been nearly as much progress in, say, the actual correctly measured wage gap between black and white as there has between men and women.
So even when you take the exact same jobs, the exact same amount of experience, the same hours worked, when you take all of that into account, you still have a really wide
There's a bigger gap, and it's actually more, because it's more difficult to measure, because when you start, men and women on average go to the same high schools. Blacks and whites on average do not go to the same high school.
Right.
So you can take education level and it doesn't mean the same thing.
Yeah.
So you're not able to.
If you're in a tougher neighborhood, you're in a tougher
Right.
high school, absolutely. So
Right.
then you've got more to overcome in your workplace.
Right, but it doesn't show up in the data, right? So you can't really
even
capture
something
everything.
like your family background or your networking skills or your network that you have available to you. Yeah, that could all be very different. So there's a lot of underlying issues.
Right, there would be more things left unexplained, but it's because there are more factors that are specific to the problem.
And I think one of the things the importance of a discussion like the one we're having today is to say to people, you can't just fix this problem by telling employers to just pay certain people more. Or that's just, you're sort of missing the point if you try to solve it that way. That looks like it's kind of an on-the-nose kind of solution. But as you said before, you may actually end up shooting yourself in the foot if you make a requirement like that, because if that person's productivity is really not up to that level, then you're making it even harder for people like that to get hired if they're required.
Well, you see affirmative action policies to get people in, certain minorities into colleges. And then there's a lot of competition for the best qualified minority students. But universities have not been discriminating on the basis of race for, at least against African Americans, for a long time.
Right.
And that's not the reason that they're not in Harvard. It's because they're being discriminated against. Because they have horrible education before they get to
at the primary and secondary
get to
level.
that choice.
Right.
But if Harvard is trying to make 6-7% of their incoming class African American, then they're getting the cream of the crop. But maybe those are not as well prepared as they should be.
Right.
And they're setting these students up to not succeed as well as if they went to a lesser school, had a better chance to compete. And you see this up and down the line.
Yeah, I'm sorry we don't have more time to discuss this. This is such a great topic, but we have to wrap it up. So thank you so much for joining us for Free Exchange today. And check us out on the web at www.lindenwood.edu/Hammond Institute.